and thank you for joining us for today's session, Frequently Asked Questions on Clinical Studies. I'm Mary Jerome, Senior Director of Medical Communications and Education at the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Nupur Rajay and Ms. Kathleen Lively from the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, and their patient, Bob Lupacino, a patient from East Longmeadow, Massachusetts. They've agreed to answer your questions about this integral part of multiple myeloma care. So first, we're going to talk about finding and joining a clinical study. So I'd like to welcome all of my speakers today. Thank you for being with us. It's really great to have you all. So my first question is to you, Dr. Rajay. So many patients and their caregivers believe that the option of joining a clinical study is only for patients who have run out of other options. Is that true?
Hi, Mary. Thank you. Thank you for having all of us on this call. And, I think this is such an important discussion right now and such a timely discussion. So I thank the MMRF for spearheading this. I would say that the answer to your question straight up is no. And I think the important thing for most people or for everybody to take away from this conversation is that we are where we are in the context of myeloma because of clinical trials. We have had an unprecedented development in terms of drugs available. We are in 2023, and we have more than 16 separate drugs which have been approved in the last 15 and 20 years. And even through a pandemic, we've been able to get clinical drug products such as CAR T cells as well as bispecifics approved. Now, your question of is this an option for patients who've run out of all options? The answer to that is absolutely not. And I think when we do clinical trials in the context of myeloma, we are doing it in all different spaces, right from sort of early precursor disease state, so when you don't even have symptoms, all the way to when your disease comes back. So when and if you're diagnosed with myeloma, I think it's really important to talk with your caregivers and see, is there a clinical trial option for me? Because most of the clinical trials that we have in the early spaces are drugs which we've already have been used in the context of myeloma. And because we're seeing such good results with them, that's why we want to use them earlier. So every patient should be inquiring about a clinical trial option.
Great. But there's no really, no really specific time in the patient journey that the patient should consider a clinical study. It really is like at any time at all during their journey.
I would say so, Mary, and I will also say that our patients have been amazing, and our patients have always agreed to participate. And, it's been a collaborative effort, and that's why we have the success that we have in myeloma.
Agree. I mean, we certainly have, as you mentioned, an unprecedented set of drugs that are approved in this space just in the past few years. So it's really been amazing. So Kathy, our patient audience has told us over the years that clinical studies are not always offered or discussed between themselves and their doctor. So how can patients and their families be more proactive in bringing up the possibility of, going onto a clinical study as part of their care?
Thank you, Mary, for that question. I think knowledge is power, and also being comfortable with your caregivers. It depends also where they are receiving care, if clinical trials are available, or if they are not in a major medical center that has a myeloma-specific treatment group, maybe they are not available. One of the best ways I think that patients and their families can approach this is to just have an open discussion on all treatment options, but also to educate themselves. And clinicaltrials.gov is a good resource to start and just look at where clinical trials are available and use that as a tool. It's a search engine. And that may give them a little more information going into the appointment themselves, but also just to have an open dialogue and ask, what are my treatment options? I know that in our team, we go through standard of care options as well as those that are presented, that present themselves as opportunities to partake in clinical trials and go through the positive and negatives of each with our patients, and almost in a team collaborative way to review what the options are that are available. So I think to open that dialogue and to feel comfortable, because for successful treatment, you need to be part of the team.
Sure.
And feel comfortable in just asking questions, coming to the appointment prepared sometimes helps. And also for it not to be one single discussion. I think that decisions don't necessarily need to be made all at once. Information can be gathered, thought about, questions asked, and thoroughly explored.
Right. So I agree that communication between the patient and their care team is exceptionally crucial in multiple myeloma. And that's one of the things that we hope to demonstrate on events like this, is having patients on these events with their care teams and sort of demonstrate how that communication is supposed to work and how it can benefit the patient. So, Robert, we're going to turn to you now and ask you a little bit about your myeloma history and how you ended up on a clinical study. So I'm going to preface this by saying that we've discussed this previously, and we know that you're on the MyDrug trial, which is one of the trials that is sponsored by the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation, and it is one of the few, if not the only, precision medicine studies ongoing in multiple myeloma right now. So can you tell us about the study and how you decided to participate?
Should I start off with the history first, do you think?
Sure. Okay. Whatever you want to do.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Dr. Rajay and Kathy, for including me on today's panel. So I'm going to start off with my myeloma history, and I'm going to go back a couple months prior to diagnosis just to provide some context to it. Back in spring, this would be spring of 2019, I'd gone to a routine dental exam. And during the dental exam, they picked up through a series of x-rays a white spot on my mandible. So I was recommended to an oral surgeon, went to the oral surgeon. They saw the same spot on their x-rays. That was left as, we'll follow up, we'll monitor. That was spring of 2019. Fall of 2019, I began to experience back pain, lower back pain, at my primary care's office. They ordered x-rays. I had x-rays done probably 3 days after that visit. And the x-rays showed multiple compression fractures in my vertebrae, multiple vertebrae. That too, and this was getting closer to diagnosis, so things started happening pretty quickly and became pretty intense. So that too, we were monitoring and following. We knew something was going on there. Early in December of that year, same year, 2019, I experienced severe muscle spasms and an elevated heart rate, muscle spasms in my abdomen that essentially would drop me to my knees. So I knew something was going on at that point. And that's when things started moving pretty quickly. I was, in and out of the emergency room at the local hospital. December 18th, I went to get out of bed that morning and experienced an incredible pain in my lower back. And at that point in time, I was immobile. I was taken to a local hospital, admitted for 15 days. And I would say halfway through that stay, they were zeroing in on a multiple myeloma diagnosis, but they weren't sure. So they ordered a bone marrow biopsy. The biopsy came back, and and confirm their suspicion.
Mhm.
So it was actually during that time of me knowing what they were looking at and the time it was confirmed that I learned about Dr. Rajay in the clinic
Mhm.
over at Mass General.
Mhm.
So while I'm in the hospital room and we were basically reaching out to the clinic to set up an initial consult with Dr. Rajay.
Mhm.
And I would say by early January, we went through the consult. I became her patient, and I was on the first line of treatment by the end of January 2020.
Wow.
Subsequent to that, 2 years out to February 2022, I'm in a clinical trial.
Mhm.
And here we are today, 16 months later.
Mhm. It's really interesting. So, and this is a story that we hear over and over of how people are diagnosed because of bone pain and things that normally happen in their back, right? So this is, it's quite common. And I applaud you for taking the step of reaching out to a multiple myeloma specialist immediately. That was probably the best thing that you could have done for your prognosis. Very excellent. So after all of this happened, Bob, how did you end up on the MyDrug study?
Well, as we were looking at the labs of the initial line of treatment that I was on, and we were that was almost 2 years on the first line,
Mhm.
is when that conversation came up to consider a clinical trial. So I met with Dr. Rajay, with Kathy, to review all of it. And of course, I had some, I was given some time, obviously, after that to discuss it with Janet, my wife,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and other members of my care team. And we, it's kind of funny because although I have the final say on everything, you rely on the expert, which is
Of
what I
course.
do,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I was given all the information thoroughly, spent a couple of days to review it, and I just decided it was the right fit for me
Mm-hmm.
at the time.
That's great. That's a really great story. So thank you for sharing that. So Dr. Rajay, let's talk about some more about clinical studies. Are there certain conditions that may make joining a clinical study very difficult? For example, any inclusion exclusion criteria, and clearly that changes from study to study. Are there things like age limits or kidney disease, or heart function, things like that have to be taken into account for patients to be considered to be able to join a clinical study? Can you tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. I think when we do clinical trials, we always have certain criteria based on which we can include a patient versus not. We try our best to be very inclusive. There are certain parameters that, from a safety standpoint, I think the biggest thing when we conduct clinical trials, it's really important, Mary, for us to make sure that it is safe for
Mm-hmm.
our patients.
Mm-hmm.
And number two, that it is the right fit for that patient, right? And that's why we generally have a portfolio of patients, which is why Kathy mentioned so nicely earlier, going on to a website such as the MMRF, such as clinicaltrials.gov. And, the nice thing with myeloma, there's a lot of resource where you can explore different clinical trial options.
Yeah,
Certainly,
sure.
myeloma tends to happen in the older patient population. So we have trials which are designed for the older patients also. So I wouldn't say that age necessarily is a cutoff. I would say there is certain issues such as your heart function, your kidney function, your lung function has to be adequate. And that is more so from a safety standpoint. We do not want you to have any adverse effects from the clinical trials, and we want to be careful that we are doing the right thing by you. So those things do play into whether or not you can participate in certain clinical trials, and they're different for different trials based on the drugs that we are using and based on the side effect profile of those drugs. So certainly it does take into account that. I will also add, outside of this, participating in a clinical trial is certainly a commitment in terms of time, in terms of travel to the site. So it is something which we don't take lightly. And at least with our team here at MGH, and I'm so fortunate to work with people like Kathy and our CRCs, our whole research support staff, we try and identify trials which are appropriate for the patient as well. So they have to be right for the patient, plus they have to fit into their lifestyle as well. So a lot of it goes into thinking about what should be the right trial for the patient.
So, and in general, patients are really only allowed to be on one clinical study at a time, right? But just because they've been on one and then went off of one doesn't mean that they're prevented from going on a different one, correct?
Yeah, that's so important for people to understand. And the other thing for people to understand also is the converse of it, Mary, because what people think is if you've been on a clinical trial for, like many of our patients have been on sequential clinical trials, and then you do a standard of care approach, can you go back on a clinical trial? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. So anytime a clinical trial is right for you and you feel good about it, try and do it. But if you decide to do a standard of care option, you can always come back to a clinical trial as well.
Yes, this is great. And as you mentioned, this is how the myeloma community has come so far with all the new drugs that we've had approved. So very important for patients to consider clinical trials when they can. So Kathy, let's talk a little bit about eligibility. So how can patients, whether they have active myeloma or maybe they have a precursor condition for myeloma like MGUS or smoldering, how can patients know of studies that they might be eligible for if their doctor doesn't raise the issue with them? And is this where getting a second opinion might be critical? I mean, I know we already talked about there's places that you can go on the internet like clinicaltrials.gov, or you can certainly go to the MMRF, and there's a number of other organizations that have clinical trial finders that specify or like that sort of concentrate in the myeloma area. And those are good places to learn things as well. But talk a little bit about eligibility and the second opinion and why that's important.
I think in general, it sort of dovetails to the first question you asked me, where just as you've alluded to, going into the appointment with some knowledge of what is out there, but also discussing with your physician and the care team what options might be available to you at that site. And if you're possibly being treated at a site that doesn't offer them, if that physician is aware or can refer you to a site that might have something available that you could explore as a patient to see if that would fit into your life. Because there are some medical centers that don't participate, or providers that don't participate that heavily in research, or their research portfolio might be limited. So then going and getting another opinion at a medical center that may have a more developed program and more of a developed research profile in multiple myeloma may be right, at least to explore and consider whether that fits into your life. And if that is an option, with the obligations of taking, into account that being part of a research study may take more time and more effort, and if that would fit in, but also that you've, as a patient, considered everything that would be right for you and right for that treatment at that time.
So, I mean, that's really good advice. And Dr. Rajay and Bob, this does sound like sort of what you went through, right? So, Bob, you were being treated somewhere, and then you went to Dr. Rajay for a second opinion, right, on your condition, and became her patient. So, Dr. Rajay, can you talk to us a little bit about how that sort of that transition of care is handled between, so for example, if a patient is being seen by a hematologist, oncologist, they've been diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and they're seen like in their community center, but then they learn about a trial that might be at Mass General, and then they would be interested in transitioning over to that clinical trial. So can you talk a little bit about how that transition between one care team and another care team happens? And we did have a number of patients who asked this question at our last webinar about clinical studies, about being afraid to offend their doctor when they got a second opinion, or when they decided to move on to a different type of study, like go from standard of care to moving into clinical trial. So just talk to us a little bit about that and what your experience in that might be.
Yeah, no, I think this is such an important thing that you brought up, and I'm sure we'll hear from you as well, Bob, as to what your perspective on this is. I will say that, patients, you have to advocate for yourself. And, it's really important, and at least in a disease like myeloma, where there is so much incredible research going on, if there is something which is right for you, I absolutely think you should seek that out and try and do that. In terms of, are you offending your actual treating team with getting a second opinion, I would argue and say the answer to that is no. End of the day, what all of us, and this includes your local hematologist, local oncologist, your local care team, as well as your specialized center, want only the best for you. And what we do at MGH is really, we communicate really closely with the care team, which is local, because it's really important to have a strong local care team as well. And there's a lot of times, remember, this is, myeloma is a journey, as you all know, whoever's on this call. We have multiple lines of treatment, and you're going through treatment over years and years. And there are times that you'd be on a clinical trial. There are times that you're going to be on sort of regular drugs. And having that participation of your local oncologist with your specialist is absolutely critical. That's something we've always done. So I think the bottom line is communication. I don't think anybody feels offended. There are, a lot of people come to me to be seen by me and then say, I would like a second opinion. And I actually encourage that second opinion, because sometimes they need to hear it from somebody else.
Exactly.
And there may be others with better ideas. So I do think we all need to be able to communicate without being afraid, and being able to seek out a diversity of opinion, because that's what's going to make your care better. And I'm just going to turn this back to you, Bob. Was there fear when you were coming out to us first, or how do you think that has been handled over the course of the few years that we've known you?
You touch on what I consider probably the most important decision that I made throughout this entire journey, was selecting a doctor, hands down, because it's that critical.
Absolutely.
There were no second thoughts when I was at the local hospital about the plan and what I was going to do. After all, I mean, you have to be your own advocate. So, when I think of it that way, and I think of the resource that we have in less than 2 hours from where I am right now, less than a 2-hour drive to get into Mass General to see Dr. Rajay, it's almost like a non-issue. I would probably travel to the end of the earth. Just do this moment right here.
I didn't ask Bob to say this, okay, Mary?
That's how important that decision is.
I don't think that anybody can argue with that, right? So, and that really goes back to myeloma as a disease and how complicated it is, right? So it's just, unless you're being seen by someone who is a true specialist in myeloma, you may not be getting the most adequate, the most up to date, the most, powerful, treatments that you could possibly be getting, right? And that's why you need to get these, second opinions, and in many cases potentially have to move on from your community center to seeing a specialist. And if you can't be there in person, to at least consult with that person, right?
Right.
And have that person consult with the doctor that you can see. You're lucky that you live close enough to a place where it's not so onerous to travel to, from where you live to Dr. Rajay in Boston and, and have your treatments. And I think that it's very telling that even people that go to see Dr. Rajay seek out a second opinion, and guarantee that second opinion is going to be different than the first opinion, because that's the way myeloma is, right? Everybody has their own opinion.
Right.
So.
But what I do find, Mary, what I do find by making that transition from the local hospital to MGH, in my case, I feel as though the doors are open to all possibilities. And it's true. Whatever's out there for the treatment of this disease, I'm going to find through the clinic. And that's a pretty reassuring feeling.
Yes, agreed. Okay, so let's move on a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit about how it is to be involved in the study. So, and we're going to ask you some of these questions, Bob. So what was the process when you decided finally that you were going to enter this study with Dr. Rajay? What was the process of screening screening into the study? So had to take certain tests to ensure that you were eligible for the study, as we discussed? And did you get the results of those tests and discuss them with Dr. Rajay? And did that help in making your decision of finally going on to the study?
Yes. We knew from the start, from the time that the study or the trial was recommended, that it was a good fit. And of course, we went through a battery of tests and imaging to qualify, which I did, obviously, and we did review at Dr. Rajay's office. So all that went according to plan. But there is a process from the time you agree to enter it to the time you're actually in it.
Right.
It certainly doesn't happen overnight or in 2 nights.
Sure. So, and in your case, in screening into the MyDrug study, you actually had to undergo some pretty extensive genomic sequencing, right? So they had to take some bone marrow and send it off to the University of Michigan, where they do the sequencing, right? To see, where you would be placed in the MyDrug study and in which of the arms that you would be placed in based on the results of that sequencing. So that's some pretty extensive screening that not a lot of patients have done before they go on to a clinical trial. So Kathy, from a research nurse perspective, how long does it take from the time that a patient agrees to be on a study to actually receiving the treatment of the study? So if it's an interventional study, obviously. So, and what steps does the care team have to take for the patient before they start treatment to ensure that everything is going smoothly?
That's a great question, Mary. Most of our screening periods from the day that a patient signs consent are 28 days. So we have a 28-day turnaround that we are allowed. More times than not, that window of time from starting screening at the signing consent, after everything's been reviewed, questions answered, everyone is comfortable. And prior to that, I must say that many times there are multiple visits, phone calls, et cetera, to make sure that information is exchanged and people are in a comfortable place. But from the time of signing consent and any studies being done that require to see if the patient is eligible and safe to move forward with the treatment, and registration happens, we do have a 28-day window, but there are times, I would say more times than not, treatment starts in 2 to 3 weeks. It depends on the studies and the turnaround for when we receive the results of this studies and are able to get them registered. If patients are greatly in need of that treatment because of where they are with their disease, we've turned it around and been able to compress it even in a shorter period of time if need be. So, but we do have usually by the criteria of entering the study a 28-day period.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that. So if you go beyond the 28-day period, does that have something to do with the date that the consent is signed? Then does the patient have to reconsent if you go past that deadline, or is that just sort of like an arbitrary thing?
Well, that's just what is usual. Every protocol has its own rules. If we would go to past that time, we would need to get special permission.
Okay.
Again, following the protocol rules, it might require a reconsent and permission to move forward, but each protocol has its own set of rules and guidelines, which we follow.
Okay, great. So, Dr. Rajay, considering this sort of time necessary to enroll the patients, how do patients that are relapsed or refractory from their treatments participate when some of these patients may need to receive their next treatment relatively quickly? And I know that this always comes into play when patients are sort of, 4 or 5 lines in and they're considering having, for example, a CAR T therapy, then they have to wait for the manufacturing of that particular therapy before they get it, and they need to have some kind of bridging therapy. So in a case like that, can a clinical study be lined up for a patient before they actually really need it?
So, this is, I think, again, really important in the case of myeloma coming back. And what Kathy highlighted is really important. I think 28 days is the outer limit. I will tell you, most of our clinical trials turnaround time is about 2 weeks or so. And that's because patients need treatment. We are not just putting people on clinical trial for the sake of putting people on trials, right? And it takes village to get everything lined up so that people can actually go onto the trial. Depending on how quickly disease is progressing, we have to take that into account, and we really have to intervene quickly sometimes. Now, with studies such as CAR T cells, because we know that there is a waiting time, we are actually, the way we've written these protocols, Mary, is to include things like bridging therapy, because we know that patients need these treatments. So we preempted that and included that in the trial. And even the regulators have allowed us to use that bridging therapy. So I think thinking about clinical trials early is important because it requires a little bit of planning, specifically things like CAR T cells where there is a waiting period. In some of the other interventional studies, we can do it a lot quicker, and patients can go on to treatment without necessarily needing bridging. But it's really important while they're waiting for us to make sure that you don't run into problems like kidney issues, heart issues, blood count issues. All of those are really, really critical, which is why we have the whole research team try and turn this around quickly.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, Bob, let's go back to you and your treatment on this study. So, so what is your treatment like being on the study compared to how it was when you were first diagnosed? So, as far as I can recall, I think that the MyDrug protocol, certainly the backbone therapy, is an all oral therapy. So you're just taking pills and you're not necessarily being infused with anything, which makes it somewhat easier, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Good. Good.
Go ahead.
So, and I know that we were talking about this, and I know that there's a number of different arms that you can go on the MyDrug study based on your genomic profiling that they do. So, did they tell you what arm that you were on?
They did, and Dr. Rajay could probably explain that a little better than I could at that point, as far as the arm.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to. So, Mary, in the interest of time, I'm not sure that we need to discuss the My Drug trial in detail.
Mhm.
Bob is on one of the arms. Obviously, it's
Sure.
a genomically driven
Yep.
trial. And, it's one of the few which is genomically driven. And if you have a certain genetic a signature, you go and use a very targeted drug. The beauty of this trial is it's all oral. And if you know what your genome is, it actually helps going on in the trial. So obviously, we did discuss all of this with Bob. We would
Yep.
not have been able to put him on the trial otherwise. But yeah,
Sure.
no, so far so good, and Bob is
Good.
doing really well. So we are happy about that.
Excellent. Excellent. Good results are always the best. So,
Absolutely.
okay. So I know that when we had our clinical studies webinar, there's always patients who ask about a placebo, Dr. Rajay. And so, can you tell us about the role of the placebo in myeloma clinical studies in particular? And talk a little bit about the difference between like the control arm of the study and the experimental arm of a study in myeloma.
Sure. I think this is, again, really an important discussion because people are afraid of going on to the trial thinking that they're not going to get sort of treatment which is going to be effective. So, what is a placebo? Placebo is something where you're not getting the experimental drug, it's just a dummy drug which is being given. And that's what's being used in this context. In myeloma, and in general, in oncology, we do not use placebos, right? We do not use the dummy drug. There are placebo controlled trials even in myeloma, but the placebo controlled trial will have the standard of care, and the dummy drug is just the placebo. So you're still getting active treatment for your disease. So there's no way, if we feel that you need treatment, you are always going to get active therapy. Now, we do have randomized trials, and those randomized trials are where we're using an experimental approach versus what we consider standard of care. The one thing I will say is we really don't have a control of which arm you end up going on to. But the fact of the matter is you're always going to get the active drug. Whether or not you get the experimental drug, it's a computer generated thing. But as long as we're not doing you any harm, as long as you're getting what you would get otherwise, there
Mhm.
is the benefit that you could get the experimental arm, but we haven't quite proven that that is the most effective strategy. So, in general, even if you have a placebo controlled trial, it is piggybacked onto whatever the standard of care is. We do not use just the dummy drug alone in myeloma, and not almost always you will be getting active therapy for your disease. The other thing I will say is, there are trials where we do first in human trials as well. And I will tell you, Mary, that we are so fortunate in the myeloma world that our patients will participate in the first in human studies as well. The beauty of myeloma is you have a biomarker, you have a blood test, and within
Mhm.
a month, we know whether or not we are responding to that. And we
Right.
will never keep a patient on a clinical trial where the treatment is not working. We
Right.
will take you off of it.
Mhm.
So, early trials, there is the potential possibility of things not working, but we know very quickly. And when we get you off that study.
Yeah. Yeah. So it is fortunate that we have so many biomarkers in the myeloma space so that it doesn't take too much effort to find out whether things are working or not. So that's actually really great for patients. So Kathy, some patients believe that clinical studies are a little bit inflexible as far as certain life circumstances that may need to be taken into account, such as vacations or weddings or other family events. So, do patients have any leeway given to them when they're participating on the study to maybe take a drug holiday or delay a dosing based on one of these life changes? Or does that mean that the patient has to withdraw from the study if they can't can't get their dose at the exact prescribed time?
Mary, that's another great question. And I'm smiling because we at Mass General really get very creative and do our best because we want our patients living with myeloma.
Mhm.
So Yes, in the beginning, especially in the phase 1 studies, if the the treatment is very intense usually, and most of them are then built so that the treatment is dialed back,
Mhm,
and the obligations are a bit less.
mhm,
That said, we do have treatment windows for different reasons.
mhm.
And as the patient gets further along in treatment and their disease is controlled, and it would be then safe for them, that they're in a good place to participate. It's not, we wouldn't really give a treatment holiday per se while they're on a research protocol. We do try to utilize those windows to the best of our ability. And if someone has something important coming up, we do proactively reach out to the sponsors, ask for permission in advance, and really work hard to make that happen, because
Mhm.
we want, again, the treatment usually does by design roll back, and the commitment does usually become less. But if the patient is in a good place in treatment, we do our
Mhm.
best to make it work. And as a care team, and I think we're pretty successful. And
Mhm.
we've not really had too much sponsor pushback um, in these situations, because they understand that patients are working hard to live a
Right,
good life with myeloma.
right, right. And having patients withdraw from studies for things like this is not in the best interest of the study, as long as everyone can be flexible and make everything work out, with the permission of the sponsors, and improving quality of life for patients while they're on these studies, and just making sure
Correct.
that everybody's happy. So
Right, correct. And you don't want to feel like or we don't even want them to feel like they're imprisoned because they're feel
sure.
like an obligation to the study. There
Mhm.
is extra commitment and extra time that is required, and we realize that and honor that. But I would say, especially our care team at Mass General, um, does our best to allow patients to take part and still live their life. I always say that one of my goals is that I want the patient to get up in the morning, and when they put their feet on the ground, not think that I have myeloma first as the first thought in their mind, that
Mhm.
they are able to move forward through their day with an optimal level of life and
Mhm.
participation, and move
Mhm.
forward. And that carries through with our approach in clinical trial participation, I would
Mhm.
say.
Mhm. Great. So Bob, let's talk a little bit about your quality of life on the study. So, have you had to deal with any side effects from being on the clinical study that you're on?
It's interesting because pretty much from day one, starting my first line of treatment, the two side effects that I experienced then and continue to experience today are really fatigue and muscle aches and pains. And they average, I would say they're 3 to 4 on their respective scales.
Hmm.
But other than, those are the most notable. But other than that,
Hmm.
really not many side effects.
Yeah. And fatigue being, a major player here. So, how do you deal with that side effect?
I'm an early riser, so I'm up by 6 o'clock,
Hmm.
sometimes earlier.
Hmm.
And depending on what I'm doing that day, and in my life now, compared to where I was 3 years ago, I can do everything I did pre-myeloma. Maybe not at the same intensity, but I can.
Hmm.
I'm a bike rider, so I go for rides on my bike. I'll
Nice.
ride 15, 20 miles. I'll
Wow.
walk,
Hmm.
work out in the yard. There's really nothing I can't do that I was doing
Hmm.
before.
Wow.
So the
Hmm.
quality, in my mind, the quality of life, of course, has changed, but I can still do the things that I was doing prior to all of this, which is
Hmm.
important.
Hmm. Yes, very important. So that's great to hear. So, Kathy, if you have a patient who's on a study and they begin experiencing some, more serious side effects, So what happens then? Does the study, if the patient needs extra care because of the side effects that they're experiencing, does the study pay for that care, or does the patient's insurance normally help pick up the tab for that extra care based on their being on the study?
So side effects, Mary, of course, we expect some, and some are just going to be along with treatment. But if you're talking about side effects that are not expected and
Mhm.
require additional care, um, you know, the hospital will offer the care that's needed. And insurance would be a part of it as well for any care, just like in any standard of care treatment or supportive care treatment.
Mhm.
When we review everything when people sign consent, um, I think that I know that our consents here are very thorough in going through each thing, but the hospital is totally behind the patient. We are always here to take care of any side effects, small ones. And if there's something larger, the care will be given. But just as in any standard of care treatments, some go through insurance. But if there was any harm, that's a different level. If there was considered for any reason to be any harm, which I've not been in that scenario or seen any of my patients, frankly, in that. But if there was anything like that, that would be another conversation. But the hospital would still, offer the care and follow through. But everything is outlined in and reviewed very thoroughly in each different protocol and addressed in that manner. Dr. Raja, do you have anything more to add to that?
Yeah, no, I would just say, whether you're on a clinical trial or not, the care you receive is for whatever clinical symptoms you come up with. And how that gets covered I don't think that should be your concern or your worry. It's your care team, which is 110% behind you, and your team is going to get you through it. Who pays for what doesn't matter end of the day, but it does eventually, as long as you're getting the care you need. And some of it goes under your insurance, some of it goes under the clinical trial, but I don't think you ever need to worry about this. Whatever care it is that you need, you will be offered. One thing I also wanted to add is living while you're on a clinical trial. I cannot speak enough about my team here. They will do anything and everything for you guys to get on to your vacations, for you to be able to visit with family, for weddings and things like that. And I can say that Kathy is one of the most resourceful people. And, I always say that my team keeps me honest, and I do what they tell me to do, right, Bob? I've told you this plenty of times. But we have an incredible group, and everybody is committed to your success and your success of living your life, not just being on the trial. That's, I think, the takeaway.
That's 100% right.
And if I can echo that a little bit, it does take a team. It does. That is one of the things that you do have as a resource when you are on a clinical trial, is a team of people that are there to support you, whether it be working out scheduling, whether it be working out side effects, whether it be, being able to contact and reach out and answer any questions a little bit easier. I will say, at least at Mass General, and what I am accustomed to, is that we as a team are very supportive, and each person in the team is equally as important, because otherwise the care is not delivered as we hold ourselves to the standard that we want it delivered for our patients.
Yeah, that's a super good point. And I think it's great for patients to hear how dedicated everyone is to making this a positive experience, right? And it's very meaningful. So along those same lines, Dr. Rajay, can you give us an idea of what the goals are for clinical studies? It's a broad question, and it depends on the type of trial. So basically, Are they designed to lower end spike values or free light chain values, achieve MRD negativity, prolong time until relapse? I think all of those things are probably goals of clinical trials, as well as finding better drugs than what are currently available. I mean, currently we have some great drugs available, but there's always something better around the corner, and we'll never get there unless we do these clinical studies.
So, absolutely. I think endpoints is a tough question to answer, and every trial has a different endpoint. But
Mhm.
end of the day, I will tell you that as a myeloma community, we work very closely. And we work very closely with our patient community, our industry partners, the regulators, which includes the FDA, and in Europe is the EMEA. And with that, we've been able to really accomplish a lot. It's not just finding new drugs and newer treatments, but how to give these new drugs in a better way and
Mhm.
how to minimize toxicity. So we've been fortunate to get so many of these drugs approved. But even with the approved drugs, we go back to study, can we give them a little bit differently so that if we saw certain toxicities when we first got them approved, and we pushed to get them approved so that more people could access them. So some of the studies would try to address your issues around toxicity. Why MRD, which you mentioned? So MRD, I think all of you are familiar with. It's minimal residual disease negative. So we've been able to get to a molecular level of negative disease by your bone marrow testing. So we have such effective treatment strategies. And the question I think most of you in the myeloma world now have, once you start a treatment, you're on that treatment for protracted periods of time. And we are beginning to, as researchers, beginning to ask the question is, can we stop the treatment? And that's where we have some of these other endpoints. So any study you think about, I think talk to your caregivers at length, talk to the research team at length, and figure out whether or not it makes sense. But the idea of doing research is to improve upon what we have today and to make tomorrow even better, and to have not just better drugs, but how do we use them better
Mhm.
in the future is what we are getting at.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a very important point as well. So, okay, we're coming up to the top of the hour. So I'm going to try to wrap up a little bit here. So the final question for all of you is, what would you tell a patient who was on the fence about whether or not to participate in a clinical study? So Bob, I'm going to start with you. What would you tell that patient?
Well, I mean, the way I looked at the clinical trial, and in a word that comes to mind is the word risk. But I looked at this as the day I was diagnosed with myeloma is the day that the ultimate risk was presented to me.
Mhm.
So based on that, and we're all made aware of that risk at the time of diagnosis. And you learn quickly that risk is going to become an everyday part of your life to some degree. It's just that way. But the risk that I look at is the ultimate risk. And whatever I have to do to mitigate that risk is what I set out to do.
Mhm.
And just to be clear, the risk I refer to is calculated risk. These aren't risks or things that I take lightly, spend a lot of time thinking about them. But the fact remains that the risks are out there. And I would never, this goes back to some of the points that were made today, I would never preclude any treatment, clinical trials or otherwise. It's that critical.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, really, all of this comes down to managing the myeloma.
Mhm.
We often talk about treatments and therapies as tools in our toolbox,
Mhm.
and that's true. And I use the analogy of you're looking at two toolboxes. One toolbox has a few tools in it, but they can't really solve all the problems. They can't really address all the needs. The other toolbox is akin to your local home center. They have racks of tools from floor to the rafters. Tools for every need. That's my toolbox.
Mhm.
That's our toolbox. That's the toolbox we share.
That's kind of a good way to think about it, I guess.
That's a nice description, Bob.
It is. It's
We
great.
gotta live up to it now.
There you
Kathy,
go.
we've
So,
got
you know,
work to do.
We
There
sure
you go.
do.
Dr. Rajay and Kathy. So there you are. You're like the Home Depot, okay? So, or Lowe's, something.
I never thought of us that way, but okay.
There you go, right? So Kathy, I'm going to echo that question to you. So, you know, when you're talking to patients about the possibility of a clinical study, I mean, how do you sort of couch that to them and in a way that sort of they can understand, you know, the importance of it and the risks like Bob was talking about?
I really think that whether it be on the phone or usually in the clinic face to face, that our care team does present the standard of care options along with the research options that are in front of patients in a very even fashion. I think then my job as the research nurse is to educate about what participating in the protocol would look like, the obligations, the possible risks and benefits, which the conversation has already been started by the physician. But for me to point out the obligations, the scheduling, the things that could happen, but also to give what the aim of the study is and to reinforce what's already been given to them and the information provided, but to remind them that they do have a care team with them, that they are ultimately in the driver's seat, that we do watch first of all to see if the study treatment is working and that they are not on the study treatment if it is not working, that they are first and foremost in the care and the designation of the care. So participating, as was said earlier, participating in research protocol treatment does not mean that they stay on it if it is not working.
Right.
And also that it empowers them that they are in the driver's seat always. If they ever decided, which I've actually not happened, maybe once in all my years of doing this, which I won't mention how long, that the patient, if they decide to come off the treatment for whatever reason, our obligation is to take them off safely and then offer alternatives, but to really let them know what it looks like, the care team that is behind them, the benefits that are, as well as the obligations of research, and really be there and let them weigh it evenly by both how their treatment, what it would look like, but also after the benefits and the risks are presented by the physician, to just go through it with them and have conversations and stay available to continue those conversations to make sure that if someone decides to take part in a clinical trial, that they are comfortable moving forward, and that is really what they want to do at that moment in time.
Sure.
And that clinical trials participation, as Dr. Rajay has said before, there are certain times when they'll fit into someone's lives and certain times where maybe they won't, or where it will fit into what they need as far as treatment, and sometimes not.
Sure. So, Dr. Rajay, we'll give you the last word on this.
Yeah, no, I'm going to echo what has been so nicely highlighted already, Mary. And I'm just going to start out by thanking everybody because, like I started out by saying, we're where we are with myeloma because of the incredible support that we have from patients. Patients have been willing to participate, and that's why we've made this progress. And without that, we would have never come this far. I will say that, when we present options to patients, it's always with what's right for that patient. Like Kathy said, there may be a time when the trial is right. There may be a time when the trial is not right. And the way I think about presenting a trial to a patient is, what are the things which are going to prevent you? What is the downside of being on a clinical trial? That's how I start my conversation. Here are the two things you need to know, which will be the downside. And if that's not a downside to them, and most of that downside is generally a scheduling or Bob having to drive 2 hours to see Kathy and I, that's the downside. If you're willing to do that, then over time it gets easier. So that makes people, it helps them decide whether this is a right fit or not. And I think the other biggest thing is, make sure you speak your mind, because we are here to listen. Nobody's trying to push people to go onto a clinical trial right away. And doing a clinical trial, if it's the right fit for you, is what I would suggest. If you don't think you're ready for it, there's a lot of other options, and that's okay as well. So make sure that you've investigated all of those possibilities. But really, end of the day, I think it's important for us to acknowledge how important it has been throughout my career. Seeing so many drugs approved is because of your willingness to participate and willingness to be a part of the whole research endeavor. So thank you.
Yes, sure. And I think no one can argue with the fact that this field has come an incredibly long way in a very short period of time. And that's due to the dedication of patients to join clinical studies and help make this progress possible as we move forward, hopefully towards a cure for this disease at some point. So we'll see how things go. But at this time, on behalf of the MMRF, I'd like to thank our panelists, Dr. Bajay and also Kathy and Bob, for joining me today. I'd like to thank everyone who's watching for taking time out of their day to watch, and ask if we would please complete our brief evaluation of this program that you'll see at the end of the session. Finally, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Adaptive Biotechnologies, Bristol Myers Squibb, Cure, GSK, Karyopharm, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda Oncology. If you have any additional questions on what you've heard today about clinical studies, please don't hesitate to call our MMRF Patient Navigation Center. Their phone number is 1-888-841-6673. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day. That concludes our broadcast.